Thank you all for coming out on a typical Leeds evening in terms of the weather. It's not the nicest environment out there at the moment, so thank you all very much for coming out tonight to what I think is going to be a very interesting event. I feel like a little bit of a fraud. I feel like a sort of a TV presenter who is doing somebody else's script, because the actual agent of this event, the person who's actually done most of the work, is not me. It's Lena. So maybe what we should do is start off by doing some introductions and maybe mention perhaps how the work that you're involved in relates to the issue around commercial academic interfaces and the translation of blue sky research. So, to be polite, let's start off with you, Lena.
Thank you so much, James. My name is Lina Jesperson. I also work in the business school on innovation management, and I'm very interested in collaborative innovation. My special area there is around medical devices, so I already share quite a few common interests with the panelists this evening. So,
yeah, hi everyone. My name's Chloe Barrett. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called DigiDentistry. We're educational resources. So we're primarily in the dental field and medical field. So really, we provide an advanced way of learning using augmented reality, so immersive and interactive technologies using animation. We target all learning domains, offer a multi-language system and an intelligent e-learning platform. So our underpinning knowledge and content that we deliver is through academics, through research, and it's expert written. So yeah, it's great to be here. Synergies.
I'm Tim Kastelle. I'm from the business school at University of Queensland. Thanks everyone for coming out. If we had weather like this in Brisbane,
National emergency.
everyone would just be in their homes burning furniture in the hopes that they'd survive. So I really appreciate everyone making the effort to come out. So I do a lot of different things. I'm the MBA director and the director of executive education for the business school. I also study innovation like Lena does. So I'm very interested in how people take ideas and convert them into value one way or another. To that end, I do research, I do teaching, I do consulting. I write a blog about innovation management. I tweet about it. I do all kinds of stuff. And then on the practice side, over the last few years, I've been working really closely with our National Science Agency, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, the CSIRO. And we've been working together to build a research commercialization program designed to help researchers have more impact with the work that they're doing. And so a lot of what I'll talk about tonight has drawn from that experience.
So hello, my name's Dr. Martin Stowe. I'm the director of Nexus. So Nexus is a new initiative from the University of Leeds. It's all about making it easier for businesses to work with us and to access the talent, the expertise, the knowledge, the facilities that the equipment has. But also, in the opposite direction, it's about working with researchers and academic teams, and again, making the work that they do, the research, more accessible in terms of looking at the impact and the translation of that. As I mentioned, the University of Leeds already has a great track record in terms of working with business, but this is all about making a step change and making sure that we're, if you like, as a university, ahead of the game. My background, I bring a very different perspective to this. The last time I was at a university was 25 plus years ago and doing my PhD. Prior to this, I was running a startup business, a tech-led startup business, working very closely with Imperial College in London. Prior to that, I had 17 years working for Johnson & Johnson, mainly in R&D and strategic leadership roles. So my expertise is very much around medical devices and diagnostics. I've done a lot of work understanding customer-patient needs, some of those unarticulated needs, and being able to match technologies and core strengths. So a lot of strategy work, both in particular business units, but also looking at the emerging markets as well. And again, I was really interested when Lena approached me, because to me, this is absolutely fundamental. I think we have a really great opportunity here in terms of thinking fundamentally differently in terms of how we are translating research, how we are making an impact, not just in the Leeds City region, but nationally as well.
Okay, thank you. So my name is James Roberts. Formerly, I'm the director of the MBA here at Leeds, and I've force some of my students to come out tonight. I'm teaching them at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, so they'll get their payback by asking me some really difficult questions. So I'm a kind of half academic, half not an academic. I actually teach strategy and innovation here, but most of my career I actually spent in strategy consulting, working for a large American firm called Oliver Wyman. And most of my projects during that time were around strategy and innovation. So I think in a way I'm bolstering Martin's perspective on what's the kind of corporate perspective on interacting with universities and with academics. Okay, so let's just briefly run over what we're going to discuss this evening to make sure that everybody knows what they're getting. And if none of this makes any sense, you're in the wrong room. Okay? So we're going to be talking about emerging opportunities for translating blue sky research into real-world impact, overcoming barriers preventing the translation and application of academic research, managerial challenges of working at the intersection of academia and industry, and strategies for collaborative innovation. Okay, so that's the overall range of subjects that we want to cover. We're going to kick off by looking at perhaps one of the most discussed but least resolved issues there, which is the barriers. It's a slightly negative way to start, but it's a kind of an important one. There's a long history of universities trying to encourage their staff to become more commercial. As far back as, 1925, apparently, University of Wisconsin was trying to look at more structured ways of encouraging their academics to think about commercial applications for their research. Very quickly, that was picked up on. MIT, University of Berkeley started setting up sort of patent offices, patent administration offices to somehow exploit some of the research that was going on. That trend was picked up on, and we saw the emergence of the classic kind of technology transfer office, which became very much this kind of standard format in the States. We in the UK picked it up rather more slowly, but for a very long time it's been the kind of standard institutional solution for how we encourage academics to become more commercial. One thing the UK has been very good at is varying institutional forms of that TTO. We have so many different terms for the kind of organizations we've set up to try and get better at this. Catapult centers, TIGs, IKCs, there's a whole range of different institutional forms. Trouble is, we're still struggling. We're still struggling to crack this. It's still a complex area, that area where commercial interests interface with kind of academic interest. It's still a debated, it's still a conflicted area. So perhaps where we need to start is what's happening in that space? What are the barriers to these two groups working together? And maybe, I think the place to start there is with Martin, because Martin has spent most of his career outside of this institution, looking in and trying to work with us. So, can I hand it over to you, Martin, in terms of the kind of barriers that you've encountered, both in terms of working in a very large company, but also quite startups as well, because I guess the problems are different.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, this is a perfect introduction to talk about Nexus, and I will talk about Nexus because, again, the way we've designed Nexus as an initiative is to really overcome many of these barriers. Some of them are perceived, but some of them are actually real barriers. I think if you look at this area, a lot of work, reports have been published over the last decade around what the barriers are. And I think a lot of those barriers are really well understood. The issue, I think, is, and I quote, this is a Science and Technology Committee at the House of Commons a couple of years ago, this tends to be a review culture. So there may be the Dowling report, there may be the Whitty report, but in reality, what tends to happen is it gets reviewed, but nothing changes. So I think what we're trying to do as Nexus and as part of the University of Leeds is actually to say, well, okay, let's actually make some difference and actually let's start to do something and do things that will help that interface. So let me just go through perhaps some of the barriers as I see them. If I start talking too long, cut me off. But one of the first barriers, I think, and again, I'm looking at this from a business perspective, is very much around how do you connect with the university. So universities are obviously very large institutes, corporates in a lot of ways, although I would argue in terms of the degree of complexity and the stakeholders, it's another dimension compared with, say, a large multinational. So again, I've often spoken about the complexity here is almost like going from 3D to 4D compared with, say, a corporate organisation, purely because of the large number of stakeholders that you have. But one of the barriers is actually around who do you connect with in the organisation. So the frustrations I've had have been immense. I can give you a lot of real-life examples, but that would bore you. But
Well, give us one or two, maybe.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to do, for instance, and again, this goes back to when I was running an R&D group in J&J, was we were keen to look at very disruptive technology around diagnostics and wound diagnostics. And we identified, based on literature searching, going to conferences, probably half a dozen universities that we wanted to work with. The challenge was actually contacting those universities and starting to talk to the right person and then starting to get traction. So one of the things I think which is really difficult is actually identifying who you want to speak to. And even if you can identify who you can speak to, I think the second barrier is making sure that you're talking the same language. So a scientist or an engineer that's been brought up in a corporate environment has a very different perspective than a researcher who's literally spent 15, 20 years in a university academic environment. So firstly, it's around how do you establish the links and how do you make those connections and how do you make it easy. The second challenge, I think, is very much around speaking the same language and, again, making sure that expectations are met, particularly around timelines. So again, something which, in a business perspective, you may want to do very, very quickly, that doesn't align with actually teaching commitments and other things within the university. So again, often they don't meet. So those are two things that we're specifically putting things in place to address. One of the things we're doing is setting up an engagement team. So these are people with commercial experience who are coming in. They've got sector level experience as well. So they've worked in business. They can talk the same language, but they connect into the university. In this case, they'll connect in through the research and innovation development managers into the academic groups and the researchers. The third challenge, which I think is actually a more holistic strategic approach. So again, it's often easy to, once you've established who you want to work with, you then actually establish that relationship, but that relationship takes time and trust to build. And again, one of the barriers is actually, again, making sure there's time to build that relationship and build that trust. Fourth area is very much around having more of a strategic view. So again, once you've built a relationship with one researcher or one research team, and that can be a very productive relationship, it's then actually around, okay, I want to work with other parts of the university. Again, how do you do that in an easy way? So does that give you some idea?
Yeah.
I can carry on talking about other barriers, but does that give you some idea?
Let me stop you there. I'm going to come on to Tim in a moment to get a slightly different perspective. But before I do, I mean, someone like J&J has got a huge staff. It's got a huge amount of resources with which to reach out to academic institutions. Can I just ask Chloe, from the perspective of someone who doesn't, okay, small and medium-sized companies who can certainly benefit from the kind of expertise a university has, it must be so challenging if you haven't got that army of people and that army of resources to reach out.
Yeah, no, absolutely that. You have to have a lot of resilience to keep getting through these. There is barriers, there always is, whether, depending whether you're dealing with university or different educational institutions, I think there is that. But yeah, we bootstrapped for quite a long time, and for us to be able to actually commercialise our products, we needed that research and needed that academic input. or we really had no validation with our product. So we could have all the tech in the world and the best developers, the best educational technologists, but actually we needed that underpinning research to say, yeah, this is a proven, we're running visual learning out, and this is how it's going to look, and this is what we can do. And I think, yeah, we're still in a position where we're always grabbing opportunities to work with academics in the field, whether that just to be say, yeah, actually, we're working on that in the university, that's a right way to go, and to give us some perspective as well. As a startup, we're moving so quickly that we can't. It is that sort of, like Martin was saying before, it's that time scale of working with the university and be able to get something up and running. We've already gone past that point. So we're on our next, say, our beta phase model. We're possibly on our third one by the time we've made connection, whereas it's hard then because we're still grabbing for that validity of our products and what that's going to look like. So yeah, absolutely having we've been talking about who we've sort of dealt with and who we've worked with. So we've tried to work with a couple of companies that have like innovation managers within the universities and have connection to that. So again, the BD managers that work within the university, and it's quite enlightening to hear that Martin's going to hopefully solve this problem as well, to look at, because the problem we had was that a lot of the business developers that went in, they weren't specialised within that area, so they'd just leave. And they found it very hard to coordinate and to actually match what SMEs wanted to work with, what researchers or academics. So that was really hard. Can
I just ask? I mean, one thing that I think the timelines thing is key.
Yes.
And I think academic research works at a certain pace, and we're actually told to work at a certain pace. And the character of skill you need for product development and iteration is a very different kettle of fish. But one of the things that has been mentioned is that sometimes we as universities, as academic institutions, can seem very opaque. Where do you start? So where did you start when you started reaching out?
It feels like a while ago now. Luckily I came from the dental area, so I did know quite a few academics within the field, so luckily that was my sphere. So I reached out to sort of contacts I already knew, and that really then led me down the path of warm intros to other universities. We went through a lot of the EDRF grant funding as well, so we got awarded quite a lot of that to actually go into Europe and connect with other universities in Europe, and that's where we're able to sort of validate our products that way as well. So I think it was finding ways that, okay, we didn't, now we're sort of bringing on different funding rounds and more established than we were before, but yeah, we just had to bootstrap and use as much connections as possible, really. So yeah, it was very tough.
Okay, so
it still is, but
so
we're getting there.
it can be challenging being outside, looking in. Tim, through your work with the Commonwealth Scientific CSIRO,
Yep.
you've actually dealt with a lot of the academics. You've had thousands of academics go through the scheme, looking from the inside out. What do they see looking at the inside out, apart from I've got 200 scripts to mark on a Friday evening?
So I think there's that, and I think that issue of time is a really important one, and just being cognizant of the different time cycles that people are working on. One of the things for me is that I've been a manager in a large corporate, I've been in startups, and I've been an academic, and I'm coming to believe that a huge part of all of this is just being able to effectively translate from one sphere to another. So part of it is time. Part of it is successful founders have deep domain knowledge like you do, and so you can make that translation. But a lot of times you just have to be able to figure out what does this bit mean in a business setting when in the academic setting we use this word, and they don't always map across. So just being able to have that capacity is really important.
Do you think we're pushing at an open door here? There seems to be a slight assumption that all academics should become commercial.
Well-
and everybody should have that built into their assessment every year. Can we take that seriously? I mean, surely there's a large group of academics who should be left alone with their blue sky research just to get on with it.
I'm not sure, right? So the thing that I've just had this thought now, so it might just be completely full of crap, but I actually think that I'm not sure that we can commercialize research.
Okay, that's a really good point.
Right, and we talk about a report culture. Both the UK and Australia every year get a report out that says we have really good ideas, we're not so good at commercializing. And I actually wonder if we just need to reconceptualize it, to think about there's research that has impact and there's research that doesn't.
Or at least doesn't immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think research that has impact is grounded in the world, right? One way or another. So you're attacking a genuine problem, so when you're talking about your J&J experience and knowing about both expressed and unexpressed needs, that's where good research comes from, right? And it may be abstract, it may be academic, it may not immediately translate into the commercial sphere, but it's still, effective research is grounded in those kinds of problems. And I think, at UQ we had, so in terms of translating, the way that I talk to all of those researchers is I don't talk about commercialization. So I don't say this is a commercialization program. The thing that I say is this is an impact program. Because most people that are researching have some outcome that they want to see. Right? They want to see people healthier.
Yeah.
They want to have a region that's more innovative and therefore more interesting to live in. They want better outcomes for older adults. They want, better understanding of how the values of the Enlightenment have carried through to now. There's something that we want to see different
so
as a consequence,
mission-driven.
right? And so at UQ, one of our most famous pieces of research is by a guy named Ian Fraser, who invented Gardasil. Gardasil prevents cervical cancer. It took him 18 years from the point where he made the medical discovery that Gardasil would work to the point where the first person was inoculated against cervical cancer. And when you ask him, and I've heard him give this talk multiple times, if you ask him, why did you go through that process, which was miserable, right? They went through multiple large corporates, right? They ended up with Merck, and that eventually took it to market. And his answer always is, well, there's no point curing mice, right? And the whole thing is, if he had just made the discovery, written the paper, tested it on mice, and let it go, by some counts you'd have said, okay, that's fine. You've ticked your boxes, you can move on to your next idea. But he didn't, he wanted to cure cancer. Right? And so you actually have to go through that effort. And
So I guess one of the things you're suggesting here is it's about spotting the right researcher with the right research at the right time, which in an organisation as big as this university is hideously difficult to do.
It can be.
So, I mean, just from my own experience of working with technology companies in the past, one of the barriers that there was always, they always mentioned me, was the institutional, and I think this is where Nexus comes in, the institutional kind of bridge between these researchers and the commercial organisation, as in, it was always characterised to me, and I'm sure things have moved on, as technology transfer offices that were overly protective of the university's, intellectual property. Also staffed with generalists who didn't particularly know the difference between life science and kind of med tech, and mainly lawyers, which is obviously the worst thing. Probably not a good thing to say in this particular group. In your experience, was that institutional environment changing and getting better, or is that exactly why we have Nexus now?
I think, based on my experience, I think that is getting better. Right. I think gaining real commercial experience and bringing that into a university in a technology transfer office, I think is challenging for a number of reasons. And I think somebody else mentioned that actually holding on to highly qualified and experienced staff is definitely a challenge, and that's still recognised in a report I was reading last week. That's one of the challenges still, actually holding on to people who have that commercial experience and can act as a bridge. I think the other thing we haven't spoken about, and which I think is absolutely critical, is if you're working with business, each business is very different. And again, one size does not fit all. So again, one of the frustrations that I had often was I'd work with a particular university and their technology transfer office, and they would say, this is how it's done. Take it or leave it, as opposed to actually saying, okay, we need to be agile, we need to be flexible, we want to make this work because it's going to be beneficial for the university and the business. So one of the things also which I feel very strongly about is building in that degree of flexibility and agility. Some of that is also on the company side, so I'm not going to, corporates can be just as bad in terms of saying, well, if we're going to do a license deal, this is how we have to do it, or this is how it needs to be structured, and these are the terms.
Yes, because your team of lawyers is even bigger.
Exactly. But I think a lot of that is driven, so when I was worldwide vice president for R&D, I would have for Ethicon, which is a large medical device company within J&J, I would have quite a lot of say in terms of the terms of that. Ultimately, it would need to be signed off by our corporate lawyers. But if I wanted to structure a deal differently, I would ultimately have quite a bit of flexibility to do that. But I think the point I'm trying to make, though, I think is, with any large organisation, part of this is around how you form partnerships which add value to both sides. And I think being agile and flexible in terms of how you construct that is really, really important.
So how does the way that Nexus has been set up in terms of, say, governance, how does that enable this flexibility and this agility?
Okay, so Nexus is essentially a separate company. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Leeds. So I have my own team, which I think helps build in some of that flexibility. And again, we can act almost as arbiters in those types of conversations.
Okay.
So again, the way I see this, I often call it a sort of a brokerage type service. But as we're talking to our contract colleagues in the technology and transfer office, we can actually act and say, well, hang on, we understand this sector, we have built a relationship with this company, actually, let's have a say in terms of, and start to influence the way that can be structured. So again, I see Nexus and the staff that I've started to recruit as partly playing that role. I think that's a really important role. I also think it's easier for us to experiment or pilot things as well, because we're not part of the larger university. And again, I've had these conversations with fairly senior members of the university staff. I would love to use Nexus as a vehicle to pilot some of this. So again, because it's at arm's length, we can say, well, okay, let's try to do something differently. So one example is, for instance, we're looking at companies that potentially could join Nexus, but rather than actually paying us for being part of the community or for space, we're looking in quite a sort of creative way in terms of how we can structure those deals, as an example.
Okay. Tim, you've given us a kind of a perspective on the individual academics. How is kind of the federal government in Australia looking at this from an institutional perspective? Are they looking at this in terms of we need new organisational forms to enable this, or is it all down to a focus on capacity and capability building at the individual level?
It's mostly building up. So I think, even this program with CSIRO, it eventually attracted $20 million of federal funding to support it. It started out with 5 of us saying, this seems like a good idea, let's try it. All right, it was essentially an underground guerrilla operation for the first 12 months that it existed. And it was only after it started to gain some momentum and started to see some impact that resources started to come in, and it got institutional support, both at the CSIRO level and at the UQ level. So, so I'm not sure that there's a lot of federal level vision around this at the moment. But and I think the other thing that's frustrating for me, and I don't know if it's different here, but I also think there's not anywhere close to enough experimenting around business models and what things should look like. And I think, so I'd be curious, how many business models have you gone through?
What do you mean? Okay,
So
one of the areas we have a big problem here is definitions. So what do you mean by business model in this particular context?
So I use it in the sense of a description of the way that an organization creates value, who it creates it for, and how it captures enough to keep itself alive.
Most organizations are not good at experimenting with business models.
No, they're not.
Products, services, but not business models.
That's the whole advantage of a startup, right? Because you don't have channels to market. We just talked about all the things that you would be jealous of with J&J, but the one advantage that you've got is you can build any business model you want.
And we can pivot quick.
Exactly,
And change
right?
quick.
And you do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. We've gone
But
through
in a
it.
way, that makes you dealing with universities even more difficult, because the one thing a university doesn't do is pivot on anything.
No.
Slowly moves in a different direction. But this is an interesting thing, because there's a big lesson here about what big companies can learn about disruptive innovation from little companies, and it is about experimenting with business models. Can you give us any examples of where you have sort of?
Yeah, definitely. I think at the beginning, I always knew we were going to, sort of license our software to educational institutions. That was how I structured it from my previous business. I set up a dental education private ones, and from that's where we discovered this gap in the market for visual applications using immersive and interactive technology, and that's where we started that from. So it was always going to be sort of a business-to-business model. But definitely, in regards to the pivoting, we've adapted our business models. So these days, looking at a startup, you can't just focus on one revenue stream. You've got to look at different revenue streams and how they would plan out and what different customers you possibly... Because at the end of the day, you're going in really doing as much research and as much work as possible, but you're quite blind to whether, you can do as much validation, but is anyone going to buy that product? And until you get your first paid customer, you're sort of in the dark. So we're definitely having the support from that point of view of just making credible content and having that accessibility to that would make startup's life a huge, especially in my area anyway, where I deal with education. It would because at the end of the day, where our purpose is to support education, whether that using technology and help enable the process. And I think education institutions is the same process. You still want to look at improving education. So yeah, I think looking at that perspective.
Can I ask a very personal question? Is there a VC in the mix? Is there a venture capital?
Yeah, there has to be. Well, not has to be, but with technology, you have to really. Technology is, anyone that is even these days, how quickly iPhones are coming out. It's changing so quickly. So the amount of we're lucky as a startup because I think it does give us an advantage over a corporate that we can pivot. And if our technology needs to change in a couple of months, we'll go out and change it. So I think that's the beauty of it. And I think that's an advantage we've got at the moment.
And it's really interesting because, again, obviously I can work for a corporate, but also a startup. And again, one of the nice things about working for a startup is you can be very reactive and you can change very quickly. So we went... The last company I led, we went from actually a business-to-business model to a business-to-consumer model directly. Now, that was a process that we could do relatively quickly. I think, again, my take on that would be, we had to get advice, and a lot of that was hard work, actually saying, okay, who are people who know this space? Who do we actually trust? How can we have those honest conversations and who can actually challenge us and hold us accountable? And I think that's a key element of a startup's journey.
So it's getting the perspective, the skills, the right kind of... Okay, that's enough questions from us, I guess. Are there any questions just on this little bit about the barriers that anybody from the audience would like to ask?
What about the academic? What about the academic?
Maybe you could introduce yourself first and give us a background. Are you an academic?
I'm an academic, I'm a neuroscientist, and we do innovative thinking. We develop devices, and but let's start with University of Leeds. I hope it will change. I've been here 6 years, and it's been quite an interesting journey. But in the conversation, I'm not hearing about the scientist. I'm hearing about the university, I'm hearing about the industry. What about the person who's doing the discovery and the work, the 18 years that this person worked on?
What do you mean, what about them in terms of what their expectations
What
are,
are
or
the
what they've been forced to
expectations?
do?
What
or-
is it that they're going to gain out of it? I mean, all we heard about was the university and the industry.
Well, I think we had some indications around some people want to cure cancer. That's probably quite a.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting question, though. I think the question is one about incentive and recognition, and what do you give up in order to dedicate this time to, you know.
Just add to that, like we're currently measured on ref output, we're currently measured on TEF output, we're not measured on impact output in any great degree. If we go for promotion, it's all on. Sorry.
We're going to be, I think.
I think impact is. I think impact is certainly creeping into certain areas, but we haven't actually, by the way, got a definition for impact. So, does anybody have any thoughts about that? What the place of the sort of scientist is in all of this?
I'll answer that because I have been working directly with scientists and I am one. So I think the thing there is that to me, what's in it is impact, and it's actually seeing your work change something out in the world, right? Because the people that I work with that are most frustrated are the ones that think they have a great idea. They've handed it to a TTO or their business development person. Nothing's happened, and they say, well, you know, either the BD person's stupid or the people they're pitching it to are stupid. But if you're too far away from the people that you're trying to work for, you can't necessarily expect somebody to jump in and fill that gap. So, and there are huge issues around metrics. And how, you know, what's a reasonable way to spend your time. But at the same time, one of the good things about being an academic is that we have, in relative terms, a lot of autonomy around how we devote our attention, right? It's restricting, and people hate that, but we still have a lot of autonomy around how we devote our attention. And so, you know, I think it makes some sense for us to spend some chunk of that attention working on those impact and that understanding of what people need up front, right? There may still be working out the business model side of it. Maybe you pass it on to a startup, or you pass it on to a well-designed organization that can help with it. But I think we have to be engaged with the people that we're trying to help as researchers. I just don't see any way around
I
it.
can't start a long conversation yet. It's a very interesting issue, and I get the feeling that for a lot of academics there's a big issue around where's the slack in the system. Do you allow me to do that? Maybe that conversation can carry on
I think that's
afterwards. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes.
I think it's more for Martin now when you were at J&J, so not now at the Nexus. Can we turn the story a little bit around? So we kind of know what the universities are the baddies. I mean, let's see the situation. Can you give an example where you had a good links with the university and there was an interesting technology available, but you and J&J somehow failed to commercialize it because of some reason that you didn't have internal resources or so on? So I think that can you give you can give also then the good example as well.
Yeah, and I'm not, and again, I'm not saying universities are baddies in any way whatsoever, because I think at the end of the day, this is a partnership and this is a collaboration, and so I think the biggest collaboration which was set up, and I was involved in setting it up, was with an American university in Massachusetts. We set up a centre of excellence there. So essentially, it wasn't just about, part of it was actually doing fundamental research, part of it was accessing clinical patients and clinical samples so we could validate some of our devices. So it was a big collaboration. It was it took a year and a half to negotiate, but actually it was a collaboration which existed for 5 years and was multi-million pounds in terms. Now, if I look at that, we also took it to the talent level as well. So I actually put engineers and scientists into that university hospital for periods of time. They came to J&J, so it was a great collaboration. Now, there's certain things that came out of that which actually were quite disruptive. Again, it probably took another 8 or 9 years to actually get that product to market, and that was a diagnostic, so it was quite problematic and it's quite a lengthy pathway to get it to market. But that, I would say, was a great success. There are also other things that came out of that, which a lot of work carried on, great work, but actually for various commercial reasons, J&J decided, or Ethicon decided, we're not moving it forward. And you just have to accept that. Now, if you're working in a commercial organisation, that often happens. You know, whether it's funding is pulled or whether there's a strategic change of direction, it could be they acquire a company, it could be divestiture of a business, but often there's factors beyond your control that happen, which actually says, okay, that project's killed, and you just have to accept it. So does that help, Castile, in terms of giving an example?
I think one of the problems is this, again, this idea of timescale and investment, in that that's a project you don't want to continue, but you're talking about somebody's life's work.
Yeah.
It's their entire career, and it's their entire.
Yeah, but again,
all I'm saying is it can be a difficult transition to.
But again, in that example, we sort of said, okay, that can be published. We obviously, the IP can be totally owned by the university. So again, it's not like we took it and said, okay, we're the bad corporation and we're not letting anybody else gain any value from that whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying that always happens, but in that case it did, because again, it was a trusted relationship which we'd built up over 6-7 years. And again, we wanted to make sure that both parties benefited from that.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop that part there. We've started to sort of unearth some of the key barriers, and I think we want to move on to what we can do about those and strategies for sort of collaborative innovation. Lena, do you want to take over a little bit and prompt some questions?
I think we touched upon quite a few of these issues already, in the sense that we talked about, research with impact is rooted in the real world. Sometimes I ask myself, am I really in the real world as an academic? I think sometimes that's not necessarily the case. So it's also, we had a lot about partnership. So it's about, we actually need to talk to each other. And this fact of, if the research is to be rooted in the real world, how do we define problems together? I think it's not only a question of how we find a solution together, but it's also how do we define them initially. Yeah. And I think a lot of the talk around culture and language about flexibility has a lot to do with this problem definition stage, as much as the delivering, as to the timescales with the example you've mentioned earlier. So personally, I think I do a lot of research around partnerships, and the one thing I learned is it's always easier to talk about them than to put them in practice. So, and I think we all know a good relationship is partly about expectation management. But ultimately, I think just navigating this on an ad hoc basis, saying, I want to collaborate, with this industry partner, and now we have a meeting, and then, we try to get maybe some funding, coming at now from an academic side. That can be really difficult if you don't have a view of how you want to address all of these barriers. And therefore, we felt it would be good to now move on with the conversation a bit and to say, what is the collaboration aspect? What are our strategies and ideas in terms of how we want to overcome these barriers together, not just like individually?
So is it all about stealing talent from the corporations and putting them into these new kind of institutions?
No, I don't think it is.
Okay. Because that's obviously what we've done.
So I actually think, obviously, if we're trying to talk the same language and trying to form partnerships for collaboration, is obviously understanding perspectives from both sides. And one of the great ways of doing that is actually saying, okay, let's recruit people from industry, put them into a university, but also vice versa as well. But so again, I think I've seen examples where we've recruited people who are just academics, and we put them in to a corporate environment. It may not necessarily be easy, but actually we've done that for particular expertise, particular knowledge and skill sets that they have. So I think that does help to bridge the gap. There's no question, no question at all about that. The other thing which I think is really important is, yeah, we can talk about partnerships and collaboration, but I'm a firm believer of actually doing something about it and starting small. So part of the strategy that we're talking about around Nexus is, you're not going to form a relationship with a large corporate and then within 6 months gain a £3 million collaborative research bid or contract bid. It is about developing that relationship in a very strategic way. It's about starting small, so it may be a small piece of work, it may be a consulting piece of work, for instance, but to build that relationship and build confidence. I also think it's important, whether it's a small startup, but particularly in a corporate, that some of those relationships are built at multiple levels within the organisation. Often, and again, based on the examples I've had, it's been the president or the company group chairman of an organisation that you've got on board and who drives it. And again, if you run into issues, having their ear and having their support is really important. So the Centre of Excellence we set up with this University of Massachusetts was a really great example because the president of the company was all over it. And in fact, he totally owned that relationship. And again, if there were issues, we would go to him.
But in terms of, if you balance that across different levels, so you have the president involved, but yet a lot of the legwork of the thinking, still also happens at a different level. So what is your strategy for integrating that, for really kind of ensuring that you get that broader team on board?
So I think a lot of that is about making sure that the scientists and the researchers spending time together, they get to know each other. So it's about forming personal relationships. So they can, if there's challenges and they need to have honest conversations, they can pick up the phone or they can meet to have those. I think it's also been very clear in terms of what the remit of the collaboration and partnership is. So again, I think it's one thing to say, oh, we want to collaborate, but actually, what does that actually mean? What are we trying to achieve? And from both organisations' perspectives, saying, well, okay, what are the benefits and what's the value? So again, me going into a collaboration with a particular company, I've got clear views in terms of what I want to get out of it, but ultimately, I need to understand what they want to get out of it, and it's then structured accordingly. But I think setting the boundaries and understanding the benefits and focusing on that is important. But I also am a firm believer of the way that these things happen is they start small and it's around personal relationships and building up personal relationships.
I think that relates very much also to what you found with the interview aspect within your program, no? That this kind of personal engagement is so important. I don't wonder whether you want to have a bit more about this program because you mentioned it a few times, but I think we still haven't presumably got a full overview of what that actually involves.
So the fundamental premise, so it's based on one big assumption, and that is that innovative new ideas need an innovative business model to achieve impact, right? So that's one thing. The second thing then, the follow-on, is that we then try to get some of the researchers to act more like some of the people in startups and actually go out and talk to the people that will use their science. Right? So that can be people in industry if it's primarily going to be business to business. But in general, we also try to get them to understand what's going on. If you are going business to business, what's going on with that business's customers? Because you actually need to understand, again, it's grounding the problem, your point about problem identification, right? That's most effectively done when the people who have the problem are involved in telling you what it is, right? And
which often they can't
and we
articulate.
skip that. They often can't, but you can understand what's going on with them, right? If you actually observe, discuss, interview, talk to them. You can't do it with a survey because that assumes that you know what the problem is. But if you get down into, tell me about the last time that you experienced this issue, what did you do? They might not be able to tell you, this is what I need, but you can at least understand this is where the issue is. So the actual practicalities of it are we get people over the 8 to 10 weeks to ideally go out and talk to about 100 people. And we do empathy-based interviewing. We spend a lot of time teaching people how to do that, and then just get them to go out and talk to people. And so they come back with, well, here's
How did
here's the business
they
model.
build in the slack in their life? Because I mean, my experience of talking
Yeah.
to university scientists is, I'm lucky if I get home at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, because
Yeah.
I'm so busy with my teaching, my admin, my kind of. So were they given 8 weeks off work? Were they? I mean, how did it actually work?
Occasionally there's corporate support.
Oh, okay.
But it gets back to the question about what about the individual researchers. So the other thing that we do is we actually, we haven't forced anyone to go through the program.
Okay. How do they
So-
select? Are they self-selecting?
So they're self-selecting, and they're self-selecting because they have something that they're working on that isn't
Okay.
having the level of impact that they hope,
Okay.
right? And so it ends up, so essentially they create their own slack.
Right.
It's not a long-term sustainable way to do it. And you know, academically speaking, it's sort of like, you know, the joke in Google when they had the 20% time for engineers that it was actually 120% time, right? And this is kind of the same thing, but for academics, it's something like 160 to 180% time.
Yeah.
But you know, you basically find that people are motivated to do that
Right.
work.
Yeah, and I guess they have to be particularly motivated because there is a big difference between going from bench to an idea to something that is actually going to work as a product, particularly in things like med tech.
Yep.
That time horizon can be enormous and take a huge amount of work and skills,
It can.
which takes a lot of determination to get through that process.
Well, and a lot of the people that we're talking about are introverts.
yeah,
Like I am, right? And so it doesn't come naturally in a lot of cases. So it's there's a lot of challenges. But right, I mean, startup runs into the same thing. That right, startups should be doing this. Most of them don't. Right, and they know deep in their hearts, well, I should be out talking to customers or clients or potential customers. But it's easier to believe that the model I have in my head is right.
I think it's that personal growth journey attached to that. So I think having what you've made that program, how much personal growth you have throughout that process, and how much you learn about yourself as a person, as well as business and everything else that comes with
I mean,
that.
I think one of the
Yeah.
things that seemed clear to me from talking to a few academic researchers is they're already innovation managers already. They just didn't know it.
Yes.
they just, and it's
Yeah.
more about kind of revealing to them how developed they are already, and then tweaking some other skills in some other areas.
It often is.
But then I think also with the growth, this the importance of relationships and building relationship throughout this period of development, how important that is. And I think I actually owe you all a little apology. You might have noticed we are missing one of the panelists today. We haven't, unfortunately, Paul Billington from the landing couldn't come today because due to ill health. However, Chloe's business is based at this shared workspace, an incubator in Manchester. And I think maybe it might be a good point to also talk a bit about what they are doing, because I think that is very much about relationship, network growing, and collaboration, with different types of relationships and partners.
Yeah. So we're based there. The business is based there at the Landing in Media City in Manchester. So it's really a mix of office space, co-working space. We have, especially it's really a growth hacking centre for early tech startups to be able to grow and have that support. We came on board quite early, so we're sort of. They are formalising a lot larger plan now, which we are still part of, which is great. But the Landing, they want to secure companies that have that scalability within their company. So at each stage of growth, how they bring the support in. So whether that be recruiting team members, investment, workspace. Accessibility to different software, hardware, etc. So it's bringing collaborative bodies in there and also setting events. It's this all theme, I think, that's working within the businesses and the scale up that you know, there's a lot of startups out there that start and fail, and it's where they can sort of stop that happening, and so and see that where that can be. So Paul, I've known Paul for a few years now. We've been to different sort of around India and places like that, regards to looking at other universities, hospitals, and look at how that's working in other countries. So Paul's a commercial director there. And unfortunately he's ill today, but so definitely if you're interested in what is happening there, 5G's just come with Vodafone as well. So there's a lot of exciting things happening.
Yeah, and I believe they have a very nice video on their website also explaining the whole model in a few more words. But I mean, I think the relationship and collaborative aspect clearly runs through all of what we already discussed, both the barriers as well as the opportunities. However, I wonder whether in the audience there are a few questions that more specifically relate towards how do you make collaboration work, or what relationships are important, or things around
Just
that.
to clarify, this platform may not work to your expectation as some blue sky researchers. We're just using it for recording. So, yeah.
Hi, hello. Can you?
I think you have to speak up. That's for the recording, for the video recording.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, hi, I'm Hamad. I'm an MBA student. I just want to, you talked about if you have an idea or if you're an SME, linking up with someone at the university or at the research center. Can you talk about more about the method or strategies that you can use to, connect with people? And is there a way of you sort of going through the barriers of any cost that might be involved, perhaps if you have a limited finances, if you're a startup or you're an individual?
Okay, shall I? So the whole idea of Nexus, as I mentioned, I think in my introduction, was about this seamless connectivity, so making it easier for businesses, so whether you're an entrepreneur, a startup, or a corporate, to connect into the university. And the way we do that, I guess, is twofold. One way is we have this engagement team. So again, it's a central point of contact, so you don't have to worry about who do I contact, you just contact this team. They will start to build a relationship, they will start to understand your needs and the business, and they will then start making those connections for you. That team also has access to funders, and also has access to expertise around grants and bids that potentially, as a small business, they could apply to in collaboration with the university. So again, funding can, whether that's Innovate UK or whatever the funding source is. So we talk to quite a lot of companies and they have no idea, for instance, how to access some of that funding. We can obviously provide expertise to do that. But the second point is around the community point, really, which is building on Chloe's point. Through Nexus, we have a physical building, which is going to open early next year. It's a £40 million investment by the university, 10,000 square metres. But the whole idea is that's a hub, it's an enabler to create this community. There's going to be some physical members of that community, so physical tenants, but there's also a virtual community which we're building. And to, I think, the points that Chloe was making, that is so critical if you're a startup business or if you're an entrepreneur. You need to talk to people who've done it before. You need to have access to funding, for instance. So again, we're linking and have links with VCs, with North Invest, with appropriate funders, so we can help them there. But also, I think part of it is we also have events and exhibition and conference space as well. And that's not just for running workshops and helping the community connect with one another. So again, it may be that we proactively understand the needs of business and say, well, actually, there's a workshop that we can pull together here on a particular topic, because actually that runs across multiple companies, across different sectors, that actually we can bring the right researchers and academics into that conversation and add real value. But that workshop may also be simple stuff around R&D tax credits or understanding how to corporately structure your company. Part of what we're doing with Nexus as well is putting an enterprise/business manager into that community. And that's also a service which doesn't cost the company anything, there's no strings attached, but they'll support the business particularly if they're working through their business plan or the business model, they want to start thinking about investment, that is a service, again, that we'll offer. So we're building that community, and I think that is absolutely key for any startup company, because again, it gives them support, and ultimately we're after nurturing and accelerating the growth of those companies.
Yeah.
You've had university both as source of some knowledge, but also customer. So how have you navigated that?
Yeah, it's been, for me, going on that point, I think doing your own research. So as if you want to, found a company and start a company, I think before you even get to the point of going to Nexus, you need to research exactly what you're going to do, the people you need to talk to within the school you want to look at. So I think it's, doing your own research as well behind that, not just going to that. I think it's difficult because, we sort of, our customers are universities, colleges, etc. And it's sort of picking out, so we have a lot of, we sort of work with a lot of authors that have written books as such, but now they want to put the work more on a technology platform for the, this generation of learners who are actually using the technology in these applications. I think we've worked with some universities to have that content, but also separate external bodies that possibly have done a lot of research throughout the time, and they're now comfortable with just working with us on that area. No, it's hard. We're still navigating through it. It's an ongoing process. I don't think we'll ever pinpoint and get it right. I think it's just a trial and error thing at the moment, which is really difficult, because if we had someone tomorrow to say do it exactly this way, that might not be right for us. So I think it's definitely just going out and sort of using your instincts and connecting with people, and it all comes back to creating this community and connecting with people who you feel will be aligned with.
Hi everyone, Paul Slater, Director of the Change Shed, studied twice at the University of Leeds, some time ago now. Lena, you talked a bit about relationships. Yes. I'm really keen just to hear from one or two of you your thoughts on what are the critical behaviours that either enable or destroy collaboration within that relationship?
I think that's a really good one. Would anyone like to start with that?
I think it's, again, just on what I personally think from our experience anyway as a company is, again, where you came from, the point of understanding what each partner wants out of that partnership, because I think that's key. If you don't understand that, then they're ultimately going to break down. So I first off need to understand if we're going to partner with that, be either another company or innovation or any different partners. I think it's understanding what ultimately they want to get out of it.
I think I agree, and I think to me it's about listening, and it's it's very easy to go into a collaboration or a partnership thinking that this is what I want or this is what we want, but actually not really understanding what the other party wants. And to me, that's all about listening, asking the right questions.
And I think we have to bear in mind that these are often quite complex decision-making and relationship groups. It's not just an academic talking to somebody in a company. There's a TTO there, there are other advisors, there's a VC. Those are a lot of expectations to manage. And I think emotionally, that can be really exhausting. So, I think there's something about having something you were mentioning around sort of endurance, tenacity, because it's going to get very frustrating. Yeah. It's just bound to be.
I think that's really tested under stress, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you see a lot of the utility companies now talking to their supply chain and their partners and saying, how will we behave? But particularly, how will we behave when, the proverbial hits the fan and people starting to feel the pressure?
Yeah.
I think I've got the microphone now. It's probably more a comment than a question specifically. Then it picks up on something that Tim said earlier, and it's really from the perspective, I suppose, of the researcher. And of course, the example you gave of the person that wanted to cure cancer and took 13 years. And in some senses, it kind of goes back to the barriers, but it's also about collaboration, which is the extent to which commercialisation can itself be a barrier to collaboration. And I was interested with the way Tim kind of described, well, he calls it impact, he doesn't call it commercialisation, I think for precisely these reasons. And let me give you an example. So one of the things I do is I'm the director of the N8 Policing Research Partnership, which is a collaboration partnership of 11 police forces, 11 police and crime commissioners, 8 universities in the north of England and a number of others. And what we're trying to do is essentially get change in policing practices that is research informed. But we also do some work which has potential commercial spin-offs. But we do work on the basis that, and this kind of conforms with what a lot of people have said, that relationships are what matter and building trusting relationships are important. But also we do it on the basis of what we call kind of a philosophy of co-production, which is that actually if you involve the people who are going to use the research in the production of the research, they're more likely to use it. Quite simple, really, set of ideas. However, if there are then commercial aspects and where you're working across universities, so we had one very good bit of work that's had potential app kind of spin-off implications, and people have now got bogged down in the universities, I'm sorry, Martin, universities, and it wasn't Leeds on this occasion, it was one of the other partners, I won't mention it, actually getting worried about who owns the IP. You know, where's all of that going to... I don't suspect your example that you started off with was really too much concerned with you know, the kind of commercial. He or she was more interested in curing cancer. And similarly, in the policing context, what the researchers want to do is change policing at the front line and make improvements so that... So my comment or question is really the extent to which actually commercialisation can be an opportunity, but can also be a barrier.
So you may have your own view, but the thing I would say is that tech transfer offices are built to sell licenses to pharmaceutical companies. If we added up university revenue via tech transfer offices, probably more than 90% of revenue would be coming from licensed pharmaceuticals. So they're really good at that. They're really terrible at examples like yours or other researchers that I've worked with that are trying to save the Great Barrier Reef, right, where, you know, they have an environmental impact that's their target. It's never going to be, they're not going to be able to sell that technology or that method to Monsanto, but somehow they need enough money to survive, right? And so we also, I think there's a great need for increased flexibility around the number and type of business models that are reasonable in an academic setting. Because if we only have one model, which is we license it, then if we cure cancer, that's fine. But if we do anything else, it becomes a barrier, not an enabler.
But I think there's another barrier there that has emerged, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years. And I mentioned the VC model advisedly in terms of, okay, let's not license, let's grow businesses. Okay, so you then get VCs attached to universities, slug-like, and we have one here, okay, and they're kind of the commercial drive to force them into areas they don't particularly want to go into is enormous. If you take the money, medtech's huge. There must be something you can do in medtech. Seems to be where every piece of research has to go somehow. So that, I think, where you are forcing researchers down particular routes where they feel very unhappy, very uncomfortable, that can be very damaging. And it seems to be happening more and more and more. And again, it's this institutional context, I think, of who is involved. And I think the biggest problem we keep on coming up with, that we've mentioned every other word, is we don't have any real definitions in this space. We're not sure what commercialization is. You know, we're not sure what enterprise and entrepreneurial behavior is. We're not sure, you know, we've had 100 years of research into this area, and we still can't seem to define anything, which makes it very difficult to analyze it and sort of, you know, come up with best practice and get better at it.
I think, no, I agree, and I think commercialisation has particular sort of connotations associated with it. You know, we tend to use the term business engagement, which I think is broader and more encompassing. again, purely for some of the reasons that you've talked about. But I think, yeah, commercialisation for me, you know, you start thinking about business models, you start thinking about particular licenses, you start thinking about spin-outs, but I think it's much broader than that, and I think that's where the opportunity lies as well.
Related to that, and I'd be curious about one thing from Chloe, but related to that is something that you mentioned earlier, Martin, as well, and that is being able to flip back and forth between being out in the world and being in the academic, in the academy, because the regions that are most successful in science-driven innovation have much more porous boundaries between the academy and outside, so that you can flip back and forth. So that, I think, is one thing. But the other thing that's really dangerous about the VC model, and you'll be aware of this, is that the math now of the size that you need to be at within 3 years or 4 years is really different than when you started, right?
The expectations, and that is then knowing, again, your timelines. Because their timelines are even shorter than your timelines. So you're, as a company, you're in between commercialisation, actually getting revenue and growing the business, then you're against VC timelines and your customer timelines, and that all has to come together. And I think with regards to startups, what we find is you have to find the right, if you're going to get external investment and you're going to grow as a startup and scale, you've got to find the right investors for your company, or you're in a lot of danger.
We have this valley of death, which we're all very aware of, where actually finding any funding is pretty challenging.
Exactly, I think it's product market fit. So understanding you have a product, you have a market for it, and what problem are you solving? So you're decreasing costs, or are you increasing revenue, and how is that going to look? And having that model down to a T, your value proposition, etc., is key before you even go and raise. And I'm actually doing a talk tomorrow in front of about 300 investors at Manchester University, actually, and they're looking at this in another way, and the fact that how are you going to align investment and universities and startups.
That sounds a very interesting conference, because I think the attitude, I think, particularly in this country, is very risk averse, and I think the attitude that's reflected by VCs as well. So, you know, there's more money out there than there ever has been, but actually the amount of money that's being invested in early startups is lower than it ever has been. So those statistics say something, and to me, you know, the VCs that I've spoken to, they want deal flow, they want neat technologies in particular sectors, because they think those are very sexy sectors and are going to give good returns, but they're not willing to take the risk. And I think there is a big gap in terms of the sort of the pre-seed, early proof of concept funding, which really does need to be met. If you look in the US, so you know, the Greater Boston innovation ecosystem is a great example where, you know, I was talking to a VC a couple of months ago there, and his attitude is he's willing to take more risk, and he recognises that actually, in fact, he sees it as a positive that if he wants to invest in an entrepreneur, his expectation is that entrepreneur will have failed several times because they've built up experience prior to actually him making an investment. So I do think in this country there's a big issue in terms of risk, and we have a very risk-averse culture. Now, I know the funding mechanism is very different. I know that universities obviously fund a lot of that earlier stage work because of their funding model, endowments and all the rest of it. But I do think the culture here is incredibly risk-averse, which makes it very challenging.
Exactly. Going off that point, so our company is actually US and UK, so we have two companies. It's actually Delaware Topco. And the reason is, in summer I actually got accepted on a Women in Tech Accelerator in Silicon Valley. So we were able to explore, the universities in San Francisco, also outside in California. And we were looking at that exactly same situation as when you are a startup and you're trying to scale. You need to bring investors on that wants to put the money in and want to give you that support, instead of being 6 months down the line, maybe not. You just can't work like that. So that's another reason why we had to sort of pivot in that area as well.
Are we getting to the end, Lena, in terms
I
of
think
where we should be wrapping up a little bit?
Slowly, yeah, I think so. But I wonder also, are there any more questions?
I'm Jekonaya, first year PhD student in the School of Politics and International Studies. My question is maybe the view from the outside. Do the academics have this business or commercialization culture, or it's something which has come in the discourse of maybe withdrawn government grants and so forth, where maybe as academics they're now trying to sustain themselves, but originally maybe the culture could have been published or perish, and that's it.
I think that's a tough question, but I think there are several aspects to that. One is the question, is it really about just commercialization? I mean, you mentioned government grants and generally research grants, and I think what we see there is a bigger drive to look or to demonstrate impact so that what the taxpayer is paying for actually delivers some useful outcome. Yeah. So I think that notion of how our research therefore should relate and should be, rooted in the real world, yeah, that push is definitely there more generally. And of course, it is problematic for some of us who do very abstract, very blue skies type of research, who we're demonstrating that can be difficult, but that doesn't mean it's not useful. Yeah, just perhaps a bit more in the long run.
So again, ask 50 academics what impact means.
Yeah.
You'll get 50 different definitions.
I was coming to that.
Yeah.
And I think
it's just one of those terms that we assume everybody kind of understands and shares
and I think
an understanding of, and we don't.
In many fields, it's also because that impact definition is that you write a nice report at the end with some policy recommendations that nobody's ever going to really read. Yeah. So this quest for impact also kind of pushed us into asking what relationships can we establish where the outside world actually wants to listen to us or wants to work with us or wants to define problems with us. And commercialization can be one avenue actually of doing so, because people are interested in what's happening there on the market and what they can gain from that and engagement. After all, we all busy and pressed for time. So I think I would see that in a wider sense. It is this wish kind of to reach out and to actually see something done outside the university, outside that kind of ivory tower. But it is also true that, of course, scarcity of resources, in particular in some areas of research, makes it very lucrative to think about engaging with businesses also for purposes of research funding. Yes, and for some fields that's easier than for others.
Can I ask our scientist, academic researcher a question? How do you see this agenda of commercialization, this agenda of impact emerging in your day-to-day life? Your day-to-day career as an academic scientist?
Reveal something here that I already work with Lena.
Oh, okay.
So I'm one of the weird ones in the sense I've already started going out and identifying groups that I need to work with.
Mm-hmm.
I've knocked on multiple engineers' doors to get the jobs done.
Okay.
I've gone and knocked on the business office and the research office because I didn't realize they didn't know that I existed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essentially me taking the steps and trying to get things moving.
Mm.
But then you still realize that there are barriers that are cultural.
Mm-hmm.
Quite commonly, I was in the US and I'm now here, and there's a big difference, huge difference.
Yeah.
Mm.
As Martin was pointing out, that the Boston culture is very different. I was in New York, and I'm here.
Mm.
It's that cultural shift. We need a cultural shift. We need to recognize that there is innovation in every field, and the innovators need to realize that they are innovating. I think that's the biggest thing. As scientists, we often do new things, but we just do it as a routine.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting paper that was published about 4 weeks ago in Nature. BBC took it up, published it all over the place. Lena sent me a link. Actually, the finding that they have is a fallacy, or it's a mistake that is commonly done early days in our labs. 1920s, there were some papers published which showed that this could be done, and they've simply redone it, tested 120 patients, poor patients, and it's gone on to nature. So it's how you sell it. Right? Because 1920s, they did it, nobody cares, we just take it for granted and we just use it routinely in the labs. So all of my students know these techniques. They've done a fantastic job of modeling it mathematically, presenting it as a big news, and it's sold. Everyone's buying it now. I mean, all the clinicians are going for it. Till we sit down and say, well, it doesn't really work.
But I just wondered, is this term impact, is this term commercialization starting to emerge in your annual performance reviews?
It emerges everywhere, but nobody really understands what it means.
Right. Okay.
So you sit through your AAM and you go, look, this is an impact. Well, no, we don't think that's quite impact here. Well, maybe not. Then what is definition of impact? And it's a common problem. Is that we still don't understand those either.
Part of it, though, too, is I think the universities are changing a lot. And it's a little bit deceptive to think, well, universities have been around for 1,000 years, so we don't, so why, for the first 900 years, they were basically around to educate monks and doctors, right? And that was 900 years of university. And then we had 50 years of university when they educated those two groups plus very wealthy people, right? And then that idea that 30% of a population would go to university, that idea is 50 years old, 60, right? But it's new, right? And publish or perish, if you go back to the original version, the very first journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, or I've got the name wrong, but right, Proceedings here in the UK, and you look at what was published in those very, 18th century versions of it, it was like moth observed flying into a tree, right? So even that idea of what a publication is and what a valid scientific observation is has been in flux, and it's a very new phenomenon. So I think there's also an element here where we're still working this out. And we have to acknowledge that we're still working it out. And things like, research excellence frameworks may or may not be helping us with that. But it's not, right, universities, it's not a set in stone, right, it's not, this is the way it's always been, this is the way it always shall be. Right, I think it's very much a moving target still, and we have to be both aware of that, and we need to be thinking about, right, if you're starting an academic career, right, there's a lot of stuff that's open for question that wasn't even 10 years ago. And if you've been in the game for 20 years or 30 years, that might seem terrifying, but, it's the reality, and I think we need to be aware of it.
Hi everyone, my name is Joana Pereira and I'm lecturer here in the business school. And I have, before I did my PhD, I had an experience as an entrepreneur. I co-founded a company. And by then I remember how it was, it was very hard. Dealing with finding customers, dealing with product development is a more than 100% job. And now I'm a full academic, okay? Full-time academic. And I still find myself an entrepreneur. Need to find co-authors, need to write, need to find the data, need to find funds, etc. So I indeed, having a perspective of both worlds, I did find difficult to commercialize, the inventions. So do you have examples that you can tell me how it works? Because academic cannot do alone, Is there an organization like Nexus taking care of the commercialization part? And what about after the profit? Can imagine that is a big deal, right? Because after there is profit, so who owns this profit? Is the university, is the academic, is the business partner? So do you have tangible examples that can make me understand better how this could work?
So I think that it's very difficult, obviously, because each concept and each, whether it's technology leading to a product or a service, is very unique. So I think it's very difficult to actually say, oh, this is how it works. And you can follow this roadmap. And at the end of that roadmap, you're going to have a growing company which is going to be making a profit. Ultimately, it could be AIM listed or could be acquired. So that's one of the challenging things about this. Nexus is all about providing support, nurturing, networking, mentors. It's all about helping with funding. So again, one of the things which I think is there's no prescribed roadmap here. People have tried to do that, even if you look at particular sectors. So medical devices and diagnostics, there have been books which have been written to say, this is what you do. But in reality, it doesn't work like that. And my experience of being leading a startup company, or I've led a couple of startup companies, is very much around you're on your own, it's a lonely place to be. Often it's pretty unique, some of the issues and challenges you face. You can get a lot of academic type, actually it's the wrong word, but theoretical advice. I won't use academic, I apologise, but theoretical advice. But ultimately, the value that I gained was actually talking to people who deep understanding of the sector and had done it multiple times before. So they literally had grey hair, and they could literally say, well, actually, 3 years ago, or a company, I don't know, 20 years ago, I found it actually had a similar issue. This is how you need to think about it. So I don't think it's prescriptive, but I think what you can do, and I think Chloe is saying the same, if you have the right environment and you're part of the right community, I think that can help you tremendously. So I'll give you another example. This enterprise business manager that we're going to put into Nexus, I see that as a resource, not just for entrepreneurs or startup companies, but also for researchers who have ideas. So they could actually talk to somebody who actually has some commercial experience and ultimately also say, well, okay, that we can give you some general advice, but ultimately you may need to talk to somebody who's an entrepreneur in the medtech field or fintech field and can actually make those connections.
Ultimately, you make your own map.
Yeah.
Ultimately, though, I think going off the IP point of view, for a company, if you're going to have external investment, especially with investors, the company has to own the IP. That's important because if you're going to scale and exit, if you've no IP assets to that company, you've got nothing really. So the way we set about bringing on whether that be professional content writers for our platform is straight away the relationship comes back to the relationship again and who's doing what role and who wants out of what. So, for instance, we provide a platform to write that academic research, but also to present that in a way that this next generation of learners is going to be learning and how we're going to present that. So that's sort of a commercial deal we have to we've worked with and adapted throughout the time. But understanding from the point of view of the professional content writer that the IP has to belong to us as a company or we will not work.
Do we have any lawyers in the room who can advise us on who owns the intellectual property for a piece of research you do whilst working at the university? It's a pretty it's an uncomfortable area, I know, but I think it's an interesting question, isn't it? Yeah. I think it does. I think it does. Yeah. But
it does vary. Even sometimes within research centres within universities.
It still varies. Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And in terms of taking equity, if it's a spin-out, again, each university has its own model. And again, there's pros and cons to all of those models. I do think, again, coming back to my point about flexibility and being adaptable, I think that's really, really important. So again, I would say that actually depends on whether it's a product or a service, depends on the sector, it depends on, I think it depends on so many factors. But yeah, if you look at Imperial, if you look at Cambridge and Oxford, they've got very defined models in terms of equity, ownership and splits.
So I think it's slowly but surely time to wrap up. There will be, though, plenty of opportunities for a continued conversation downstairs with food and drink provided by the business school and LSSI. And I hope that we will continue that conversation.
Are you motioning because you need to say something? Or?
Me?
Yeah. Okay.
Exciting jazz hand.
Yeah, I couldn't tell.
Jazz hand.
Sorry.
So therefore, I think without much further ado, I think I shall thank the panelists for making the time and coming today. I thank all of you for engaging with us here. And I hope that you found some new insights into how to collaborate to actually achieve impact in the real world, whatever that means we found. Okay.